My name is Dennis Cooley. I am the director of the Northern Plains Ethics Institute at North Dakota State University. And we've been hosting with some very thoughtful sponsors a series of talks on learning the language of diversity and meaningful inclusion, moving from hedgehog thinking to fox engagement. And so our President Brashani will be introducing our speaker in just a moment, but before that happens, I want to thank Professor Tallbear, who gave our February talk. Her indigenization, reconciliation, and decolonization in science has already borne fruit. We have a person on campus who thinks that we might be able to use her example in order to raise funds to bring in more Indigenous students and Indigenous faculty members. So they are working with Professor Tallbear on that. She's very kindly is helping us give advice to us. I also want to mention that our final speaker will be in April. She is Kelly Elizabeth Wright. She will be talking about unpacking and confronting linguistic racism. The final series will be right on point for learning the language of diversity and meaningful inclusion. That, by the way, will be Monday, April 19th. So I will no longer take any more of your time because the topic that we're going to be discussing and the speaker has a lot to say that we want to think about and discuss with her. So I'm turning it over to the president of the university, Dean Brashani, who has been a constant supporter of the series and other efforts to bring diversity to campus. President Brashani.
Well, thank you, Dr. Cooley, for such a gracious introduction, and thank everyone for joining. It looks like we've still got numbers climbing, but we're well over 60. And I can see why. We've got a terrific speaker today. Joo Ok Kim is an assistant professor of American Studies at the University of Kansas. Her book, Warring Genealogies, Race, Kinship, and the Korean War, examines racial legacies of the Korean War through to Chicano culture production and U.S. archives of white supremacy. Today's event is sponsored by the Northern Plains Ethics Institute, the End Issue Office of the President, the College of Arts, Humanities, and Social Science, the YMCA of Cass Clay, Humanities ND, and the Department of Anthropology and Sociology. Welcome everyone to what I think is going to be a very contemporary presentation by Dr. Kim. And at this point, I will turn it over to her and look forward to sharing the experience with you all.
All right. Thank you to everyone, to Dennis Cooley, to Tyler Waltz, Dean Brashani, and others at the Northern Plains Ethics Institute at North Dakota State University. I really appreciate the opportunity to present today, and I've learned so much from the series, as have my undergraduate students. I would also like to thank attendees for sharing your afternoon with us. And while the title and content of today's talk has been planned in advance, I do think that we can make some sufficient space to think further about the Atlanta shootings from last week. On the morning of Tuesday, March 16th, I was asked to consider giving a guest lecture for the Department of Homeland Security in the greater Kansas City area. The occasion for this request is the Department of Homeland Security's observance of Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month. And the invitation was for their programming in the month of May. DHS requests for this discussion included conversations on the rise of hate crimes against Asian American populations due to COVID-19, prior occurrences of hate crimes against Asian Americans, and stereotypes or misconceptions regarding Asian Americans. On the afternoon of Tuesday, March 16, in the greater Atlanta region, a 21-year-old white man shot and killed 8 people and caused severe gunshot injuries to a 9th person. The shooter killed 6 women of East Asian descent. And I was thinking, what might it mean for the Department of Homeland Security to seek programming on the causes of anti-Asian violence on the day that the shooter targeted and killed 8 people, the majority of whom were Asian women? And how might we work through both the implicit an explicit function of DHS itself as one of the vectors authorizing anti-Asian violence. I framed today's talk on attending to racial violence and anti-racism through the events of March 16. My talk centers misogyny, gender violence, and white supremacy. It'll touch on a little bit of immigration history in the US. And I'd like to urge us to think about how these forms of violence and history are deeply entangled and how they operate in tandem rather than separately from each other. The shooter killed 8 people, 7 of them women, 6 of East Asian descent. They were targeted for being Asian women who worked in inexpensive spa and massage parlor businesses, small businesses. These occupations are low-waged service jobs, often devalued as feminized labor, often not accompanied by labor protections. It's a form of service work that is not contingent on speaking fluent English. It's a form of service work that doesn't require investment in the physical infrastructure of, let's say, a restaurant or a laundry facility. Likewise, it's a form of service work that doesn't require the intangible capital affixed to accessing educational infrastructure. It's a form of service work that's available to a person who encounters linguistic, material, and cultural marginalization within most contemporary US contexts. The labor itself of massage and other forms of body work is deeply interpersonal. It requires physical proximity and intimacy. And it's a personal labor, form of labor. Yet the shooter exempted the Asian women he shot from any form of personhood, relationality, or humanity. The stories of the women and their lives, their complexities, just didn't count. To the shooter, the Asian women were interchangeable items that represented his sexual compulsion, his entitlement to target their bodies, his so-called need to eliminate temptation. This is the story he's told, and this is the story that the county sheriff's office captain has told about the shooter. The shooter and the captain engaged in a narrative building exercise that didn't require much reading between the lines to assess their priorities, which were, of course, not about the 8 people who were killed. And even as I recognize the importance of this particular shooting and its contextual specificities, I also want to remind us of the much older story that underwrites this one. That much older story, which is in fact the history of this nation state, is continually rehearsed through multiple vectors of violence. And I'll discuss just a few of the vectors as the backstory for the Atlanta shooting: misogyny, white supremacy, and immigration restrictions. We might consider the Page Act of 1875 as these backstories. And, this is one of the earliest federal immigration laws restricting entry into the United States. And I would think that, some of you are very familiar with this law. The Page Act has been invoked in many of the common opinion pieces and news coverage that's come out about the shootings. And what you see on this screen is, this is from the Library of Congress. They have a PDF of the document, but it's just the first section of the act as it was presented to the congressional session in 1875. So while the law purports to restrict, quote, the immigration of any subject of China, Japan, or any Oriental country, end quote, for, quote, lewd and immoral purposes, end quote. It was aimed specifically at restricting the immigration of Chinese women. And, you know, the lewd and immoral purposes here, we should read as the US state's concern with regulating prostitution and sex work. And so while it was aimed specifically at targeting prostitution and sex work, in particular by Chinese women, but also, you know, any subject of China, Japan, or any Oriental country, scholars have observed that, quote, that this law, quote, prevented the formation of families and generations among Chinese immigrants, end quote. And that's from Lisa Lowe's book, Immigrant Acts, which is the first bullet point on this. And the significance of this is, of course, that it was a xenophobic restriction designed to limit the literal physical reproduction of Chinese families within the US. Right? An Asian American history professor's formulation of the discourses leading to the Page Act is especially resonant and especially troubling within the context of the Atlanta shooting. And I'm looking here, I'll be reading out loud the second bullet point. Quote, by 1875, the belief had developed that Chinese women were naturally inclined toward prostitution, and that they were especially dangerous because they corrupted the morals of young American males, end quote. And this is K. Scott Wong's definition of the keyword war in the edited collection Keywords for Asian American Studies. And so in addition to the horrific resonance this past week of the idea that Asian women corrupt the morals of young male Americans and Americans in 1875, and I think persisting to now as being tantamount to white. The Page Act also implicates the other contemporary anti-Asian discourse, which equates Asians as synonymous with disease. And we're at the, you know, we are where we are after about a year or so. Discourse from the highest office in the nation, targeting Asian bodies, in particular, Chinese bodies as carriers of COVID-19, right? And this is reflected in the language used by the former president. This is the final bullet point on the slide. I'll read out loud, quote, the sexual labor of Chinese prostitutes was believed to be the nexus through which germs and disease could most easily be transmitted to white men. And this prompted the AMA, which is the American Medical Association, to study whether Chinese prostitutes were poisoning the nation's bloodstream. And again, the concern here, the contextual concern is the protection of white men in particular and whiteness in general. So what we see here are the twinned persistence of misogynist, white supremacist beliefs in institutions of power, such as the American Medical Association and in Congress. As white supremacist organizations, the AMA and Congress defined the hypersexualization of Asian women and attached that hypersexualization to both moral sickness and transmittable disease. And these beliefs were then translated and codified into federal immigration restriction. So I'd like to take a moment here and return to March 16 with the DHS request to discuss the rise in hate crimes against Asian Americans due to COVID-19, prior hate crimes directed at Asian Americans, and stereotypes or misconceptions about Asian Americans. And again, I'm restating the invitation to present and the subjects that the Department of Homeland Security of Greater Kansas City covered. The Department of Homeland Security as some of you will remember, was is sort of an umbrella organization that absorbed the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, the USCIS, in 2002, which was when DHS was created in response to 9/11. But prior to the late 19th century, there really was no formalized regulation of immigration, certainly not at the federal level. And in fact, the Page Act of 1875 functioned as a cornerstone consolidating xenophobic immigration restriction. And along with the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, specifically targeted East Asian immigration. So when the Department of Homeland Security requests discussions about the rise in hate crimes against Asian Americans due to COVID-19, they could look to some of their own templates from 1875 that prefigured Asian women as hypersexual, diseased threats, endangering the morality of young white men. DHS could reconsider in requesting discussions on prior hate crimes directed at Asian Americans, whether the motivation is understanding the hate, to examine white supremacy as a structure determining the lives and deaths of racialized peoples, including people of Asian descent, or whether the motivation is placed on the crime, which would then have the impact of expanding the prosecutorial powers under DHS, which no doubt would unevenly and disproportionately target Black, Brown, Indigenous, and Asian peoples. And as for stereotypes or misconceptions about Asian Americans, the agency really should look back to the histories that inform the creation, their own creation story. But in offering this longer story behind DHS, what's also needed is a rethinking of both Homeland and Security, right, in the Department of Homeland Security. And in the previous lecture for this series, which is available through the Northern Plains Ethics Institute YouTube channel, I believe, Dr. Kim Tallbear reoriented us toward the traditional homelands of Indigenous nations and peoples in her land and tribal acknowledgements. And in her biocolonialism lecture, Dr. Tallbear discusses the repatriation of extracted Indigenous biomatter, such as DNA pulled from bones and blood. And that discussion also reflects the decolonial commitment to material repatriation of land, reflects her commitment to the understanding of decolonialization from Eve Tuck and Wayne Yang as not a metaphor, but as a commitment to material redistribution, perhaps in the very same way that North Dakota State University, it sounds like, is launching the possibility of that in the recruitment of Indigenous students and Indigenous faculty members. And so, I would urge us, especially in light of this series, to interrogate the context of Homeland within how we learn from Dr. Tallbear's lecture. And in rethinking security in the Department of Homeland Security, we must understand that the institution of policing in the United States is directly connected to the white supremacist structure of this settler colonial nation. The institution of policing is one engineered to protect white lives and property. And the institution authorizes the use of police to degrade, to harass, to assault, to dehumanize, and to murder anyone, especially Black, Indigenous, Brown, and other non-white peoples, if they're perceived as a threat to whiteness. White life, white property. And while state-sanctioned police killing is not what happened in last week's Atlanta shooting, right? This is not a murder that's tantamount to Chauvin's killing of George Floyd. I'd still like to offer a connection in this story that's told by the shooter and the captain of the sheriff's office. And this is the story about white racial innocence and victimhood that's invoked in so-called civilian killings. As I noted earlier, the stories of the Asian women and their lives, their complexities for the shooter just did not count. The older story of the Page Act from 1875 prescripted Asian women's dehumanization, prescripted, Asian women as interchangeable items that again represented the shooter's sexual compulsion, entitlement to target their bodies, and the so-called need to eliminate temptation. The sheriff's captain, after initial questioning of the shooter, worked to construct a narrative of the shooter having a bad day and lashing out. Couldn't or wouldn't see how appalling it is to humanize a mass murderer in the immediate aftermath of a mass murder, or didn't, and made the choice to align his story with the shooter rather than with the killed Asian women. This kind of white supremacist alignment recalls another shooting by a 21-year-old white man, Dylan Roof, who, if you'll recall, in 2015, murdered 9 Black people at a Bible study in Charleston, South Carolina. Police afforded Roof the courtesy of a gentle arrest and later bought him hamburgers. And the other consideration about both Robert Aaron Long, who is the shooter in Atlanta, and Dylan Roof is the time that they spent within proximity of or within the setting of the shootings. So I believe, and this is based on the more recent coverage, there was CCTV footage of Long sitting in his car for about 1 hour before he executed the first shootings. And Dylan Roof was part of the Bible study. I think he was there for about 45 minutes to an hour, engaged in fellowship at the church in South Carolina, right? And so what strikes me is the taking of their time in proximity to the scenes of violence, even as they would, go on to render time an unthinkable possibility for the people who are killed, right? And this isn't, by any means a developed thought, and I am in no way trying to suggest that there's, some connection beyond the coincidence of that time. But what stories are being crafted in those moments prior to the murders that the shooters carry out? And I'd like to close with the consideration that each of these white supremacist murders events is horrific for each of us, even as we carry different relationships to the killings of Black, Brown, Indigenous, and Asian peoples, right? This is really important. regardless of whether or not we acknowledge that we have a relationship to these events, we do, and they should be felt as horrific as they are. The killings urge us to seriously examine how white supremacy and misogyny structure our thinking, how they structure our stories, our lives, and our deaths. These are not new considerations. And as I hope I've demonstrated, they are certainly not new stories. So the charge is on us. We can certainly write better ones, and we must. And on the screen, I wanted to give acknowledgement to the names of the people who were killed by Robert Aaron Long in Atlanta on March 16th. This graphic is from the website listed in the title box, and CAN-WIN stands for Korean American Women in Need, which is a direct service domestic violence organization in the Chicago metropolitan area. Thank you.
Thank you for taking on that issue. And what I want, folks, it's time for our questions. As always, if you would put them in the chat, that would be the best. And what we'll have as a conversation. I wanted to ask something that might be a little bit off just to get us started with. I've been reading about some of the issues in regards to bias in regards to schooling. So I'm not sure if you saw some of the reporting that's been done on schools in which kids have to earn their way into the schools. They're very top level schools, so Harvard, Yale, but it's also, we're talking about grade schools, high schools, and so on. And one I was reading about was in the DC area. So the representation of Asian American children is very high. The parents of this school district wanted to change it from being merit-based to a different criterion in order to reduce, it was approximately 2/3 of the kids were Asian American, and to reduce it down to about 1/3. So they wanted to drop it about 1/2. And they were using Black or African-American children, Hispanic children, say we need to increase the numbers of these. What they were actually doing though, because they hadn't bothered to look at this, was increasing the number of white kids that were going to be in the school. So this attitude, this violence, when I was thinking about it, how could anybody actually do something to sit in a car for 1 hour and then go in and kill people who are just making a living, just living their lives? Do you think there's a bigger connection of just an prejudice against Asian Americans in the country, a resentment or something like that, that might help us sort of grasp how this could have happened?
Thank you for that question. And while I'm not equipped to comment on the specific DC school scenario that you brought up, I do want to talk about a few tropes that are important when thinking about the history of race in the US in general, and the history of Asian American studies perhaps in particular. And the first one, the one that perhaps attends the older story of the Page Act in 1875, is the story of the Yellow Peril. It is one that constructs Chinese people in particular within the mid to late 19th century, but it's also one that has been revitalized and refashioned in different moments throughout US history. And when thinking about the Yellow Peril, it is constructed very much as a threat to the white nation, to the white way of being, For instance, we might think about white workers' resistance to Chinese workers in the aftermath of the California gold rush, right? That the Chinese Exclusion Act was one that was entirely based on concerns of consolidating white capital and wealth and getting rid of competition from competition that was articulated as unfair competition by Chinese immigrant workers. And this idea is repurposed throughout US history in different moments. The next big sort of touchstone moment might be during the Second World War, when the United States incarcerated people of Japanese descent and seized their property, their livelihoods, right? And in that case, it didn't matter whether those individuals were citizens of the United States. That fact was not recognized as significant. If you are able to take a look at the case that decides, one of the cases that sanctions incarceration of Japanese individuals during the Second World War, the language of one of the justices refers to individuals of Japanese descent as snakes, and that this is something that is sort of endemic within people having Japanese ancestry. And so the specter of the so-called Yellow Peril is raised again in that moment in order to, justify what was very much a racist incarceration of a particular group of people, again, with regard to whether or not they had attained the markers of US citizenship. In other words, you could be the quote unquote picture perfect model family, and that was not going to prevent the internment of those families. Most recently, I do think that the most recent specters that we see might be, again, the discourses of diseasing COVID-19 being affixed to Asian bodies and East Asian bodies in particular, and Chinese bodies in particular. And that attends the anxiety, perhaps the broader geopolitical anxiety that the United States has about foreign policy, about global competition with China. And it rides on, the past year of really persistent and truly relentless demonizing of China by the previous administration. And so the point of tracing, these, the specter of the Yellow Peril throughout history is to suggest that, these are not news stories, that they are incredibly persistent vectors of racism, of sexism, and that in each interest, it is ultimately for the designated for the protection of white lives and white property and white capital. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, Dennis, but that's one very, I've been talking for a long time. That's
No, that's fine. It's by the way, if you have questions, as I said, please put them in chat or send them to me. I actually have one that was sent to me. So I will be asking along those lines. I'm putting the one that was sent to me to the side for the moment, because some of what you said made me start thinking about some things that we've learned from Professor Tallbear and Professor Hodge, which is racism is one word. Professor Appia taught us that there are different types of racism. So there are racism. And I think that's right. The experience, the lived experience of each of these groups is different, and how it manifests itself is vastly different. So when you're talking about groups that are underrepresented, say well, they're told, well, you're not working hard enough, you're not taking care of your opportunities, you don't merit this. And then when you talk about Asian Americans, oh, no, you're cheating. There's something unfair that you're doing. And when the example that I had was when it was said, look, these kids who are here earn this. They work their tails off. The reply was, well, their parents have money and they have tutors and things like that, dismissing the work that these kids had been doing. So I think what is coming out is each of these is vastly different, has overlap, but they're still vastly different. And if you're going to be thinking about them, you have to think about the learned or the lived experience that these groups, or is that too general? Is that too simplistic a way of approaching it, do you think?
I think it's interesting to consider both the possibility of full lived realities and complexities, as you noted, and to acknowledge, the efforts and labor of people. I would also say, though, that even as we might be allured by the idea of a merit-based system, by the idea of a meritocracy, it really presumes that as an objective, stable, fixed level terrain. And I think this series has shown in spectacularly helpful ways that that's absolutely not the case, right? So that's one response. The other response would be to consider the attendant discourse that comes along with Yellow Peril, or that kind of vacillates between the two, which would be the myth of the model minority. And this myth would be represented by hardworking, quiet, submissive, docile, and so on and so forth, not making, splashy waves, not wanting to make trouble. All of these are, again, the stereotypes attached to the model minority myth. And it's a myth because it's one that is instrumentally useful for the state, right? One of the purposes of wielding this discourse is precisely to justify the reduction of material resources and social support, in particular for Black and Brown folks, right? And I'm thinking especially about from 1970s on, when we see a commitment to dismantling social welfare and social support systems. And so that would be, I think, another serious idea to hold in tension with the idea of the Yellow Peril. And also to, so again, to observe historically how they play out together. I think there are some of those discourses that are, both of them are circulating in different ways right now. But, as to your point about the school system, I'm not familiar with the specific case that you describe in the DC area, I believe, but I do think that ultimately where the kind of insistence and agitation is coming from, and to ask what the motivation for it is, right? Because I think for this particular context, you noted that it was really about white parents perceiving some kind of unfair advantage claimed by these students who are from quote unquote like Asian families or backgrounds, however that was noted or said. but sort of deployed the idea of like, no, it's unfair for Black and brown kids that this happens, when the spirit of it was really, we want our white children to have this quote unquote merit-based system. And again, I don't know this particular context, but I think if I can assess from your description of it.
Well, thank you. And I have a question here from Karen. I don't have a last name. So what we usually like to do is have folks, if they've written a question, to turn their sound on, or the thing on. So this one, it talks about, is Karen there who sent me a question? Or do you love the sound of my voice?
Yep,
there's Karen.
Yep, you're on it. I love the sound of your voice, but I'm here too to share mine. It's Karen Van Fossen. Thank you. Many thanks to Professor Joo Ok Kim for this powerful reflection. And I'd like to share a question. To what extent do you believe the economic system in the US helps create a context for racism, misogyny, and the horrific violence like in Atlanta last week?
Karen, thank you for your question. Yeah, I mean, so, I'm going to start with my sort of, reflection on Dr. Tallbear's lecture, which I think everyone should watch and not just take my word for it, because I'm afraid I'm absolutely not doing justice to the depth and richness of her research. But part of not taking decolonization as a metaphor in the way that she articulated by using the article by Wayne Yang and Eve Tuck had to do with serious commitment to repatriation of Indigenous lands and a redistribution of the kinds of wealth that had been extracted from Indigenous lands and life. And within the scope of her research talk, it was conceptualized as repatriating various forms of biomatter. And so, that's one avenue, one starting point. Thinking about whose lands we are inhabiting, what kinds of, wealth has been produced through the extraction of resources from those lands, who did the laboring in order to create the profit and value, and ultimately where that wealth, profit, and value ended up being concentrated. Another way to consider answering your question might be to think about, as I mentioned in my talk, the institution of policing as one that's designed to protect white lives and white property. And so, that's another way to potentially think about the incredibly important role that the economic system in the US has for the continuation of certain white supremacist practices. In relation to the killings in Atlanta last week, I think some of those larger structural considerations are not so easily grafted on because we do lack context. We might think about the fact that, we might presume at this point that many of the workers were working in low wage capacities, many of the women who were killed. And so we might consider their class status. And, I think not all of them were working because they necessarily needed the money to survive. I think some folks were supporting family members in the US and elsewhere. I think for other folks, it was not necessarily a situation that, had a direct correspondence to their immediate livelihoods. I mean, the stories vary, right? I also think about the US military as a massive economic engine in this country, and how centuries of building up the US military has entirely naturalized and normalized. And by building up, I mean infrastructurally, in terms of the proportion of the money that's gone to support the military, the US foreign policy imperatives that rationalize or justify the continued buildup of the US military. And the connection I'm trying to make here is the naturalization as a result of centuries of building it up, of arms, of gun violence, of, thinking about writ large US arms sales to states, to other nation states, and thinking too about how that kind of naturalization of weapons and guns is really, I think, has become sort of second nature, or has become so normalized as to exempt critique or consideration, if that makes sense. So that's not necessarily, I'm not trying to make a direct one-on-one correlation between the US investment, the massive US investments in military infrastructure, and this particular individual case, shooting in Atlanta last year. But I do see the refusal, or the way that the normalization of this kind of use of weapons is directly contributing to the violence. Karen, does that address your question? Did you have thoughts that you wanted to share about it?
Oh, thank you very much. That definitely addressed my question. And I appreciate being able to consider the larger contexts in which these horrific events happen. And your point about the increased militarization of our kind of our imaginations, how that makes something like this more possible. So thank you very much. I really appreciate your reflection.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I have one from Leanne Wolf on trade policy with China and racism. Is Leanne here? Would you unmute and read your question?
Thank you, Dennis. So my question had to do with, goes back to when you were talking about foreign policy and trade policy with China. And, I have some Chinese students in my class, and one in particular, he and I have wonderful conversations and cultural and trade conversations. And one of the things that we talk about is, the trade, tariffs with China were meant to improve the trade between the United States and China, and obviously they didn't do that. And one of the goals was China's approach to patents, right? Because one of the issues that US companies have is when they contract with manufacturers in China, they risk losing their patents because the patent rules are not the same. And as you were talking, I recognize there's a difference, cultural difference, in how China views patents and how the US views patents. And is there a way to address this foreign policy, this trade policy that isn't racist? I'm just really curious about that. How do we engage in foreign and trade policy with China in a way that is not racist?
Thank you, Leanne, for your question. Again, I don't actually know that I'm equipped to answer the finer details of US foreign policy and trade agreements with China. And but I am heartened to hear about the conversations that you are having with your students. And again, you know, I appreciate the way you framed it. Like, is there a way to do this that's not racist? I'm not sure. I think there is always a way to learn from the old stories and to rescript better ways of being, of, you know, creating community, of thinking about mutual interdependence and so on and so forth. But when you brought up patents in particular, I started, you know, this like association thing going off on P words. So I was thinking about patents, I was thinking about proprietary things, I was thinking about property. And this does relate to some of the thoughts that emerged from Karen's question, which is, you know, how do we define ownership and property in a way that doesn't have to be about the concentration of what that gets this, you know, sole creator or patent holder. And I mean that in the sense not to dismiss the work of you know, people who of creators, but to think about how there is never one individual who sort of like by themselves was able to come up with like a singular brilliant idea that they are entitled to wholly. Does that sort of make sense? So maybe, and again, I'm not sure if cultural difference is necessarily the phrase I would use, but I do think that all of us, like globally, most of us at any rate, could definitely stand to examine our ideological commitments, examine what might have shaped them, and to create different understandings of being with each other, or different understandings of interdependence that doesn't have to be proprietary. So that would be one way of responding to your specific question, which I'm afraid, you know, I won't be able to address the finer points of.
And I honestly, I didn't think you would be able to do the finer points, nor can I, frankly, because, you know, to be immersed in it is one thing, and to have a philosophical general questioning, exploring it. I think it's fascinating because, you know, we don't take into consideration the differences of cultures, and this is not to make all Asian, Chinese, Japanese, all the cultures to be identical, because they're not, and that would be unfair to group them. Looking at China as a collectivistic society in general, and then to think about, you know, how individualistic we are, which goes exactly to your point about how we define ownership and proprietary nature. I think those are concepts we need to be willing to explore, and that's it raises lots of interesting questions that go directly to how do we approach policy, and how do we approach trade, and how do we approach different things. And it is about power and wealth and all of those things. So thank you very much.
I think part of what we're hearing is what we've been learning through this entire series about not understanding each other. There's a difference we've learned between knowing and understanding. Knowing is where you really have a lot of shared experience, so you can know what's going on. Understanding is where you have enough shared experiences so you can sort of figure out what's happening, and then you sort of have empathy with that. I want Joy Annette, who wrote a comment here. I see Joy on my screen. Joy, would you be willing to talk about your comment or mention that to Professor Kim?
20 years ago, I was a history teacher. I taught high schools. And one of the things that I was able to get by with my principal, who was very, very supportive, was I taught American history with all nationalities during all time frames. So if you were learning about the 1880s, you were learning about our Japanese citizens. We were learning about the Native American citizens. We were learning about the Black American citizens. Everything was taught during the same time. Yet this week, North Dakota had the opportunity to be able to advance our society with recognizing our minorities as being a very important part of our history. They voted down teaching Native American history in grade schools and in high schools, which I think is just a travesty. Not only should it start there, but it should also start with our other minorities, because with them not being seen by our young people, they're not seeing them as being part of our culture, part of our society, when we're only seeing Eurocentric ideas in that our history is only starting from the 1776. So I think a lot of our racism starts with that, because our children are not seeing minorities as being part of our society at large. They're seeing them as putting in this corner, putting them in that corner, and not really being a part of the American society. And I think it continues on and is coming more to a point nowadays, because our young minority students saying, hey, look at me, I am here. And I think that is a big contention of what is going on right now in our United States.
Joy, thank you for that comment and for the context in North Dakota. I was not aware of it, and so I appreciate learning about it from you. It looks like there's a comment from Cecile Axelian in the chat that also connects your comment to teach African American history, period, right? To not have it like temporally designated to the month of February. And so and thank you for the teaching that you have done in your classes that really is about examining the comparative racial histories of the formation of the US. I think your observation also threads through Dr. Hodges' lecture and Dr. Talbert's lecture, in the sense that their concern is with epistemology, and like Dennis said earlier, on the conditions of knowing. How do we learn what we learn, and on the desire to come to understanding, perhaps. But if I recall correctly, Dr. Hodge had the word epistemology, I think, in his lecture title, and Dr. Talbert's lecture itself, while it was not, it was absolutely part of her talk. And there was a focused through line that really argued for centering and focusing non-Eurocentric ways of learning in both of those lectures. I think, I would certainly argue for that. And to think about what's lost when, or what's perpetuated when these histories are not observed in our classes. And I'm really curious to know, because I'm not familiar at all. It does sound like Native American and Indigenous history in particular had been singled out for this particular vote at the through the K-12 level. And that's remarkably disconcerting, that if it was Native American and Indigenous history that was singled out to not be taught. And I'm curious if it is just that it's not required, or that it can't be taught. I think what I'm understanding is that it's not a requirement, that North Dakota, the voters of North Dakota missed an opportunity to make learning Native American Indigenous history a required part of K-12 education. Am I understanding that correctly?
I believe so, not only, in the classroom, but it's because it's not a requirement now. I feel that the inroads that we have taken so far, is having our American Indian, groups in Fargo, West Fargo, what's going to happen with them? What's going to happen with the federal monies that's being allocated to our Native American students if they can't learn about their own culture in our own schools? That's something that, it's a giant step that could have been taken by our society. Yet again, we're put in the back, not to be upfront, and this is, all of North Dakota. We have one of the largest Indigenous populations here. We should be learning about our own culture. Yet we don't, even when we have our Native American culture in our colleges, we're put with a foreign language. We're not a foreign language, we're a first language. So, but these are the types of things that our students are seeing. And then you wonder why, we have this, discontention with all of our minority students because they're not being seen. So yeah, it's something that it's not only Native American, culture in our history that should be here, but also we need to learn about our other minority students because they are here, they're not going anywhere. We need to know about our past so we can move on to our future and have a better future.
I see in the chat that Florin added about textbooks on US history deliberately minimize or outright ignore pre-Columbian history, the history of indigenous people in these lands, and the history of slavery in the US, among many other critical subjects in this regard. So I'm going to add a complexity here. So when we're talking about race, what sometimes happens is it's just race. So we have a checklist, these groups. But as you started off with, you're absolutely right, there's intersectionalities here. It's not merely race, it's lived experiences of women who are Asian American, men who are Black, and so on. So could you say a little bit more about the intersectionalities and the complexities that brings? I know, by the way, that is probably a hugely unfair question because I'm asking you to lift the world using the flimsiest web, spider web. But I think this is important because if we're going to be talking about the understanding we have to bring in this complexity because that's really what is part of this. It isn't just these particular groups in this one particular area, but it's the intersectionalities of this. Do you think?
Yes, thank you. I would like to, yes, respond to your point in relation to Lauren's first remark on US history deliberately minimizing or outright ignoring pre-Columbian history, history of Indigenous people in the lands, history of slavery in the US, among many other critical subjects. And your attention to intersectionality and what I understand as Joy's practice of putting these conversations in relation to each other, right? To make them affiliate, to give them proximity in a way that is not disentangled from each other's histories. So to give an example of how implicated we each are within all of these histories, we might think about the additional precarities borne by immigrant women, documented or not, across the board within the US context. The final slide I showed that had the website for Korean American Women in Need that's one resource that I might direct folks to when I think about intersectionality as in the way that Kimberly Crenshaw has used it. In particular, she, one of the instances was discussing the specific institutional vulnerabilities that are made as barricades for women who are undocumented, for women who are not speakers of English when accessing domestic violence resources, right? And so those are truly important. I mean, they are the important kind of factors that can determine what kinds of access certain subjects have to safe lives. And so I absolutely want to, think about your understanding of intersectionality within this context, within the context of, the shootings of last week. We might also think about the ways that, the only quote unquote racial immigration restriction acts within US federal policy, Chinese Exclusion Act, Page Act, that they in fact then paved conditions for the targeting of immigration restriction based on all kinds of criteria, right? We might think about the attempt to instantiate a federal Muslim ban, and Muslim is racialized in a very particular way in 2016. And how that connects to the teaching of history, both at the college and at high school levels. I think it appears that Florin has offered more context, right? So on the one hand, it has the impact of disempowering. If your way of seeing the world is structured through a Eurocentric way or a white supremacist way, it is at that very introductory level disempowering. It could be seen as dehumanizing, right? Like if there's a history and your history is not represented, or your history is represented only to the extent that it is as a conquered indigenous nation, or as a conquered nation state, or an occupied nation state in East Asia, that could absolutely impact, how we understand, perceive, and see the world, especially because those histories, the disempowering versions are like that we see through the victor's gaze, right? We see the victor's white supremacist gaze. So that what we end up with is an understanding of Asian raced bodies through the lens of Page Act, let's say, right? And I am always looking for ways to think about our interconnected histories in ways that not just point out the horrors and the violence of the U.S. nation states and its the U.S. nation state and its imperial actions, but also in a way that is really life-affirming, that is responding to cultural, political practices that are from the ground up by particular communities that do seize control of redirecting narratives in a way that goes beyond even just saying, oh, like this is bad, but this is how we can inspire what we've learned to generate a collective future for all of us, right? So, that was a very long response to your initial question on intersectionality, but those are the ways that I see it, especially as unfolding in the conversations we've been having thus far.
I think part of this is what we need to talk about. If we're actually going to do a practical, pragmatic job with addressing racism and these other isms, is I think you're using the term narrative. I would use the term conceptual frameworks. And Joy put this down. She wrote, a very important factor when addressing women in history is the matriarchal governments versus patriarchal governments and how it impacts domestic lives. Again, this would be a change of conceptual frameworks. How you understand the data are the same coming in, but how you're using it, how you're thinking about that as a whole is determined by how your, as I said, lived experience, what you've learned, and how you structure it. So if this is very basic to one's thinking, and we had this, our December speaker, Mei Ling Halim's work was how children get stereotypes, that this is a natural sort of thing for us to make categories, but where we get into trouble is where that's becomes stereotypes. So she was doing child psychology. But once that is in as a child, when we're learning it as a child, it's really hard to address or to change. And I'm going to ask another unfair question, because that's what I do, is everybody who knows me knows this. So my thinking is we can manage this at best. So I agree with Professor Appia, we can manage it, we can't get rid of it. Once these frameworks are in place, narratives are in place, you can't change them, you can alter them, but I'm hoping somebody can convince me otherwise. What do you think? Is it something we can actually alter in a significant, important way, or is it something we just can manage at best?
Speaking of conceptual frameworks, I mean, thank you for that point, and for tying to, another one of the lectures in the series, alter, manage, and significant. Perhaps we might revise our conceptual frameworks of each of those things. I mean, they have happened, right? If we think about the ongoing work, the work that has never stopped for Black liberation, for recognition of Indigenous sovereignties. If we think about abolition not as something that happened with the stroke of a pen from like a white supremacist president, right? Abraham Lincoln, but as a practice that has continually struggled for the liberation of Black peoples, and continues on to thinking about the abolition of prisons, right? In that way, that kind of alteration is always happening, that it hasn't stopped. And I understand what you're saying about the incredible power of categories and how rigid that they might appear. But, that doesn't stop people from continually agitating to make things better for all of us. And I don't mean to be so like naively optimistic about it, but I also don't want to lose the hope that regardless of whether we see it or not, whether it makes sense to our conceptual frameworks, that work has been happening for centuries and it will continue to happen. And when you say significance or importance, each of these acts are significant, right? They may not necessarily register as a quote unquote big deal impact in some of the histories, or in history as we've been taught to conceptualize history. But to dismiss or devalue even the smallest act, I think is, we could reframe how we consider that, right? And the people who do this work, like one of the most hopeful things that I find is that I am fortunate enough in my life to be able to work with amazing students, undergraduate and graduate, to be able to work with brilliant colleagues, and to be able to work with some of the best staff members at the University of Kansas. And each time I encounter or meet a new student in my classes, I think, I'm so lucky to know you, but also you're just like you just happen to be the one who I got to meet in my classroom, right? In other words, these conversations are happening everywhere. And the fact that we are not privy to all of them doesn't mean that they're not happening. And when I kind of multiply all of the struggles that are continually ongoing for all of our liberations, right? For our liberation, I'm, I feel like there is supremely good company for the very difficult task ahead.
And I'm going to draw this to a close because you have been doing a lot of question answering and off the fly, and some really hard questions you've been answering. But I think you're absolutely right that a complex issue that has been built up over hundreds, if not thousands of years, isn't going to be solved in one day with just a few people doing it. It is multiple actions, it is multiple interactions, because we're social animals. We have to be more engaged in our interactions. And so eventually those frameworks, I'm hoping, even though for older folks like I am, it's harder for us. Those frameworks are hard to change, but as kids are coming up, I think we're seeing better and better how it's working a little bit better each time, so the framework gets better. And eventually we'll move to a place where everyone has equal opportunity to flourish and our communities to flourish. But now I'm being optimistic. I wanted to make sure I matched your optimism, Professor Kim.
I mean, I don't feel the need to. I tend to be like relentlessly so, and it's not something, it's a personality thing, but it also, I think, is a political imperative in some ways to not lose, to not let down, in fact, all of the people who've struggled to get each of us here to this space, by losing that kind of hope, and being really cognizant of the danger, of the political dangers that attends, whatever generational hope that you're seeing, right? There's no guarantee that it will always go the way that we might want it to, or that we have different or competing definitions of like what better is as well.
Right. Well, on that note, I want to thank Professor Kim for another excellent piece in our series on learning the language of diversity and meaningful inclusion. This lecture has been recorded. It will be edited and uploaded to the Northern Plains Ethics Institute's Facebook page, our YouTube channel, and our website. If you mentioned that you might be able to send us some links to different groups. We will also put those up as well, so that folks will have more resources to take away. I want to remind folks again that our next speaker is April 19th, which is a Monday at noon. It is Kelly Elizabeth Wright. She will be talking about unpacking confronting linguistic racism. An announcement will be going out soon on that and how to access that. I also want to thank the folks who have been sponsoring this for the year series that we've been doing: the Office of the President at NDSU, Humanities North Dakota, the College of Arts, Humanities and Social Science, the Department of Sociology and Anthropology, and my folks at the Northern Plains Ethics Institute. So thank you very much for attending. And I think that's it. If Professor Kim will stay on, we will have a little bit of talk. I'll see you all later. Have a great day. It's springtime in North Dakota. Yes. See y'all later.